Hello, friend. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Perhaps you're in Toronto, where the Haudenosaunee once shaped the land beneath your feet. Maybe you're in New Mexico, where Pueblo people still dance ceremonies their ancestors performed 1,000 years ago. Or perhaps you're somewhere far from this continent, drawn by curiosity about stories that predate the nation-states we know today. Tonight, we're embarking on something different, something vast and intricate. We're not exploring the mythology of a single people, but rather the interconnected web of sacred stories that span 2 continents, encompassing hundreds of distinct nations, each with their own cosmologies, their own gods, their own explanations for how the world came to be and how humans should live within it. Picture this. It's somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. The last ice age is slowly releasing its grip on the planet. Across a land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska, a place called Beringia, now submerged beneath the Bering Strait, groups of people are moving. To them, they're simply following the animals, seeking warmer lands, continuing the eternal human search for a place to call home. These migrations happen over thousands of years, wave after wave, until humans have spread from the Arctic tundra to the southern tip of what we now call South America. What makes Native American mythology so remarkable, so different from the mythological systems many of us grew up learning about, is its sheer diversity. When we speak of Greek mythology, we're talking about a relatively cohesive system. Zeus and his pantheon, the Titans, the underworld ruled by Hades. Norse mythology, too, has its clear structure, Odin and the Aesir, the world tree Yggdrasil, Ragnarok. But Native American mythology? We're talking about the sacred stories of the Inuit in the Arctic, who tell of Sedna, the sea goddess who controls the animals of the ocean. We're talking about the Navajo of the Southwest, with their complex creation story involving multiple worlds and the holy people. We're talking about the Lakota of the Great Plains, with White Buffalo Calf Woman bringing the sacred pipe. We're talking about the Iroquois of the Eastern Woodlands, with Sky Woman falling through a hole in the sky to land on the back of a great turtle. These are not variations of the same story. They are distinct mythological universes, each perfectly adapted to the landscape, climate, and way of life of the people who told them. And yet, woven through this incredible diversity, there are threads, common themes that appear again and again, suggesting something universal about how humans make sense of existence. The challenge we face tonight is this. How do we tell the story of something so vast without reducing it to stereotypes? How do we honor the specificity of each tradition while also recognizing the patterns that connect them? The answer, I think, lies in understanding that Native American mythology isn't a relic of the past. It's a living, breathing tradition that has evolved and adapted for millennia, surviving colonization, forced assimilation, and systematic attempts to erase it. These stories matter because they represent humanity's longest continuous relationship with the lands of the Americas. They contain ecological knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. They preserve ways of thinking about humanity's relationship to nature that Western philosophy is only now beginning to appreciate. They challenge our assumptions about progress, ownership, and what it means to live a good life. What you're about to hear is not the definitive story of Native American mythology. No single account could be. Instead, think of this as a journey through time and across landscapes, exploring how different peoples answered the fundamental questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? How should we live? What happens when we die? And most importantly, how do we maintain balance in a world of constant change? We'll begin in the time before time with the creation stories that explain how the earth itself came to be. We'll witness the age of transformation, when animals could become human and humans could become animals, when the rules of reality were still being written. We'll explore the arrival of culture heroes, beings who taught humans how to hunt, how to grow corn, how to conduct ceremonies, how to live in harmony with the natural world. We'll see how these mythologies adapted as societies grew more complex, as trading networks expanded, as different peoples came into contact and exchanged ideas. And we'll trace the devastating impact of European colonization, not just the physical destruction, but the assault on these mythological systems themselves, and the remarkable resilience of indigenous peoples in preserving and adapting their sacred stories even in the face of overwhelming pressure to abandon them. Now, let's begin at the very beginning, before there was earth or sky, before there was light or darkness, before there was anything at all except the possibility of everything. Let's begin with creation itself. In the beginning, there was water. This is where many creation stories start, though the details vary dramatically depending on who's telling the story and where they come from. For the Iroquois peoples of the eastern woodlands, the world began in the sky world, a place of light and peace above the clouds. There, Sky Woman lived among her people, until one day she fell, or was pushed, depending on which version you hear, through a hole in the sky. Below was nothing but endless ocean. Sky Woman tumbled through the air, and the water birds saw her falling. They flew up to catch her on their wings, but they couldn't hold her forever. They needed land, so the animals dove down into the depths, trying to bring up mud from the bottom of the primordial ocean. Otter tried and failed. Beaver tried and failed. Finally, Muskrat dove so deep he nearly drowned, but he came back up with a pawful of mud clutched to his chest. This mud was placed on the back of a great turtle, and it began to grow and expand, becoming the earth itself. This is why many indigenous peoples of the Northeast refer to North America as Turtle Island. Sky Woman brought with her seeds from the sky world, which she planted on this new earth. From these seeds grew the plants that would sustain human life. The story goes deeper. Sky Woman had a daughter who would later give birth to twin sons, one good and one evil, who would shape the world through their constant opposition, creating the balance of light and darkness, life and death that characterizes existence. Now travel west and south to the desert southwest, and you'll hear something entirely different from the Diné, the Navajo people. They speak not of a single creation, but of emergence through multiple worlds. In the Navajo creation story, beings lived in lower worlds of darkness before emerging into this one. The first world was black, inhabited by insect beings. When conflict arose there, they climbed up into the second world, which was blue. More conflict, more emergence. The third world was yellow, and finally, they emerged into the fourth world. This world we live in now, the glittering world, where the sun shines and humans take their current form. In this fourth world, the holy people, supernatural beings of immense power, created the first man and first woman from corn, that sacred plant that would become the foundation of so many Native American societies. They created the sun and moon, positioned the stars, formed the mountains that mark the boundaries of Diné land, and established the principles of Hojo, harmony, balance, beauty, the proper order of things. Among the Lakota of the Great Plains, creation has a different flavor entirely. The story begins with Inyan, the rock, who existed alone in the void. Inyan had all the power in the universe contained within himself, but he was lonely. To create companions, he squeezed blood from his veins. This blood became the waters, and the loss of blood caused Inyan to shrink and harden, becoming the stones and rocks that cover the earth. From the waters rose Maka, the earth. From Inyan's essence came Skan, the sky, the source of motion and change. And from their interactions came We, the sun, who brought light to the world. These are just three of hundreds of creation stories, each perfectly calibrated to reflect the environment and values of the people who preserved them. Arctic peoples told of a world created from the body of a slain giant or shaped from ice and snow. Coastal peoples in the Pacific Northwest spoke of Raven, the trickster creator who stole the sun and released it into the sky, who created rivers and forests through his cunning and creativity. Peoples of the Great Basin told of a time when the world was smaller, when animals were larger and more powerful, when Coyote wandered the earth bringing both gifts and chaos. What unites many of these stories is the concept that creation wasn't a single event but a process, often a collaborative one. The earth wasn't spoken into existence by a single all-powerful deity. Instead, it emerged through the actions of multiple beings, through sacrifice, through trial and error, through cooperation between different forms of life. Sky Woman needed the animals to save her. The Navajo people needed the holy people to guide them through the worlds. Even the powerful Inyan needed to give up something of himself to create others. This reflects a fundamentally different worldview from the Abrahamic religions that would later collide with these traditions. In many Native American mythologies, there's no sharp division between the sacred and the profane, between creator and creation. The earth isn't something made for humans to dominate. It's something humans emerged from, something they're kin to. The animals aren't lesser beings placed here for human use. They're often portrayed as older, wiser, sometimes more powerful than humans. Many creation stories feature animals as the first beings, with humans arriving late to a world already populated and organized. This has profound implications for how these societies understood their place in the world. If creation is collaborative and ongoing, then maintaining balance isn't just a nice idea, it's a sacred obligation. If animals and plants are your relatives, gifted to you by creator beings, then hunting and harvesting become acts that require respect, ritual, and reciprocity. You don't just take, you give thanks. You don't waste, you honor the sacrifice. You don't put yourself above nature. You recognize yourself as part of nature's intricate web. The creation stories also established the basic rules of existence: death and rebirth, the changing seasons, the necessity of both good and difficult things in life. The Iroquois twins, one good and one mischievous, didn't destroy each other. They balanced each other, creating a world that contained both ease and challenge, both safety and danger. This wasn't viewed as a flaw in creation, but as its essential nature. A world of only light would be as unlivable as a world of only darkness. These foundational myths did more than explain where the world came from. They provided templates for how to live. They established which places were sacred, which animals were kin, which plants were medicine, which ceremonies would maintain the balance. They created origin points for clans and families, explaining why certain groups had special responsibilities towards certain animals or natural features. They justified social structures while also limiting the power of leaders. After all, if creation itself was collaborative, how could one person claim absolute authority? Once the world was created, it needed to be made livable for humans. This is where the next layer of mythology comes in: the age of transformation, when the rules of reality were still malleable, when beings could shift between forms, when the boundaries between human and animal, physical and spiritual, were permeable and constantly being tested. This was the time of the animal people, or the first people, depending on the tradition. In many northwestern coastal mythologies, these were the beings who lived before humans existed in their current form, creatures who looked and acted like humans, but could also be ravens, eagles, salmon, or bears. They spoke, they reasoned, They had families and conflicts and desires just like humans would later. But they also possessed abilities that modern humans lack. They could transform their shape. They could travel between the physical and spirit worlds. They could communicate with all forms of life. The Coyote stories, found across vast stretches of the West and Southwest, capture this era perfectly. Coyote is many things: creator, destroyer, teacher, fool, culture hero, selfish troublemaker. In one story, he's bringing fire to humans. In another, he's causing problems through his inability to control his appetites or follow instructions. He's simultaneously admired and criticized, powerful and ridiculous. He represents the duality within human nature itself, our capacity for both wisdom and foolishness, generosity and selfishness, creation and destruction. Among the Lakota, the figure of Iktomi the spider fills a similar role, a trickster whose schemes usually backfire but occasionally result in something beneficial for the people. The Haida and Tlingit peoples of the Pacific Northwest have Raven, who stole the sun but also taught humans valuable lessons through his misadventures. The Inuit have Amaguk, the wolf trickster. The Ojibwe have Nanabojo, who is sometimes portrayed as a great teacher and sometimes as a bungling fool who learns through his mistakes. These trickster figures served multiple purposes in the mythological framework. On one level, they entertained. These are genuinely funny stories, designed to make people laugh, to lighten the burden of difficult winters or challenging times. But they also taught. Every foolish thing Coyote did became a lesson in what not to do. His failures to share food properly taught the importance of generosity. His inability to respect boundaries showed the danger of overreaching. His tendency to think he was cleverer than he actually was demonstrated the value of humility. But the transformation age wasn't only about tricksters. It was also when culture heroes emerged, beings who brought essential knowledge and gifts to humanity. White Buffalo Calf Woman of Lakota tradition appeared during a time of famine, bringing the sacred pipe and teaching the 7 sacred ceremonies that would maintain the people's connection to the sacred. She established protocols for how to pray, how to conduct sweat lodge ceremonies, how to seek visions, how to properly transition from one stage of life to another. Among the Iroquois, a figure called the Peacemaker, his actual name is often not spoken out loud, appeared during a time of brutal warfare between the 5 nations. He brought a message of peace and unity, establishing the great law of peace that would unite the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This wasn't just mythology, it was the actual constitutional framework that governed 5 and later 6 nations, predating European colonization by centuries. The story of the Peacemaker combines mythological elements. He was born to a virgin, he performed miraculous demonstrations of his power, with very practical political philosophy about how to end cycles of revenge and create lasting peace. For many agricultural societies, corn mothers or corn maidens played central mythological roles. The Cherokee tell of Selu, the corn mother, whose body produced corn and beans to feed her family. When her sons discovered the source of this miraculous food, they killed her, thinking she was a witch. But she had predicted this and left instructions. Drag her body across cleared ground, and where her blood fell, corn would grow. This story explains the origin of corn while also encoding agricultural knowledge, the need to clear land, the cycle of sacrifice and renewal, the sacred nature of the harvest. These early mythological developments paralleled the actual historical development of Native American societies. As people transitioned from primarily hunting and gathering lifestyles to more settled agricultural communities, the mythologies evolved to reflect these changes. Creation stories remained, but new layers were added. Stories about how humans learned to cultivate crops, how they learned to build permanent structures, how they organized themselves into villages and towns. The mythology also began to reflect increasing social complexity. As societies grew larger and developed more specialized roles, the spirit world became more elaborate. Simple animistic beliefs that all things have spirits expanded into complex pantheons of deities associated with specific natural phenomena, specific places, specific aspects of human life. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest developed an intricate religious calendar tied to agricultural cycles, with different kachinas, spirit beings, appearing at different times of year to bring blessings and teach lessons. Trade networks that crisscrossed the continents brought different peoples into contact, and their mythologies began to influence each other. Themes and motifs spread, adapted to local conditions. The idea of the world being carried on the back of a turtle, for instance, appears in multiple traditions across the eastern woodlands and Great Lakes regions, though the details vary. Stories about underwater panthers, powerful, dangerous beings living in rivers and lakes, appear in traditions from the plains to the southeast. As Native American societies grew more complex, their mythologies began to encode and justify increasingly sophisticated forms of social organization. The sacred stories that had once explained the creation of the world and the origins of cultural practices now also explained why certain people held certain roles, why particular families had specific responsibilities, why leadership worked the way it did. Among the Aztec civilization of central Mexico, which, yes, we must include in any comprehensive discussion of Native American mythology, despite often being separated in Western categorization, the mythology became deeply intertwined with imperial power. The Aztecs believed they were the chosen people of Huitzilopochtli, the sun god and god of war. According to their mythology, the current world, the fifth sun, was maintained through the sun's daily battle against darkness, and this battle required nourishment in the form of human blood and hearts. This theological framework justified the Aztec practice of human sacrifice and their military campaigns to capture prisoners for these rituals. But we must be careful here. The Aztec case is often sensationalized and used to portray Native American religions as inherently violent or barbaric. In reality, it was an outlier, not the norm. Most Native American mythological systems emphasized harmony, balance, and reciprocity rather than constant warfare and sacrifice. The Aztec example does, however, demonstrate how mythology and political power could become intertwined, a pattern that appeared in less extreme forms throughout the Americas. In the Pacific Northwest, among the Tlingit, Haida, and other coastal peoples, mythology established the clan system that would govern society. Every person belonged to one of several clans, often named for animals: raven, eagle, bear, wolf, and others. The mythology told the story of how these clans originated, usually involving an ancestral encounter between a human and the clan animal, resulting in a special relationship of kinship and responsibility. These weren't just charming stories. They determined who you could marry. You had to marry outside your clan. What symbols you could display on totem poles and other art, what rights and responsibilities you inherited, what territories your family could use. The totem poles themselves, often misunderstood as objects of worship, were actually three-dimensional representations of family mythological histories. A pole might display the clan crest animal at the top, followed by figures representing significant events in the family's history, often mythological encounters or transformations that established the family's status and rights. To read a totem pole was to read a genealogy that blended human and mythological time, that made no real distinction between historical events and sacred stories. Both were equally true, equally important. Constitution. This wasn't purely secular governance, it was deeply rooted in mythology. The peacemaker had brought this law from the Creator. The 50 chiefs who led the Confederacy represented not just political positions, but mythologically ordained roles. The clan mothers, who had the power to appoint and remove these chiefs, derived their authority from the mythological status of women as life-givers and nurturers. The Iroquois mythology included sophisticated concepts of consensus building, checks and balances, and the rights of individual nations within a confederation. Decisions required extensive discussion and unanimous agreement. Any nation could leave if it felt the Confederacy no longer served its interests. These weren't abstract political principles debated by philosophers. They were understood as divine instructions, the way the Creator intended people to govern themselves. In the Southwest, the Pueblo peoples developed a religious system centered on kivas, underground ceremonial chambers that represented the sipapu, the hole through which humans emerged into this world in their creation mythology. The kiva itself was a mythological space, a liminal zone between the underworld from which humanity came and the surface world where they now lived. The ceremonies conducted in kivas weren't just rituals, they were reenactments of mythological events, ways of literally bringing the sacred past into the present moment. Different kiva societies held different knowledge, different ceremonial responsibilities, different relationships with different spirit beings. These weren't random assignments. Mythology explained why the Snake Society had responsibility for certain ceremonies, why the Flute Society performed others, why the Antelope Society had specific duties. Power and knowledge were distributed across multiple groups, each with its mythologically mandated role, creating a system where no single person or group could dominate. The mound builder cultures of the eastern United States, which flourished between roughly 3500 BCE and the 1600 CE, created massive earthworks, pyramids, effigy mounds shaped like animals, or abstract symbols, complex geometric designs. We don't have their mythologies directly. They didn't have writing systems that survived. But we can infer from the archaeological evidence and from the oral traditions of their descendants that these structures were mythologically significant. They aligned with astronomical events, marked sacred landscapes, served as burial sites for important leaders, and probably functioned as stages for ritual reenactments of mythological events. By around 900 to 1500 CE, many Native American societies had reached remarkable levels of sophistication, their mythologies perfectly integrated with complex social, political, and economic systems. This was the period when Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was larger than London, when the ancestral Pueblo people were building elaborate cliff dwellings and great houses with hundreds of rooms. When trading networks connected the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic to the Pacific. The mythology of this era reflected confidence, abundance, and mastery. Consider the Mississippian culture that built Cahokia and dozens of other mound cities. Their iconography, found on pottery, shell engravings, and copper plates, depicts a rich mythological world. We see birdmen, powerful beings that combined human and raptor characteristics, probably representing warriors or elites who had achieved supernatural status. We see underwater panthers, those dangerous beings who controlled the rivers and demanded respect. We see the cosmos divided into three realms: the upper world of birds and sky, the middle world of humans, and the lower world of water creatures and chthonic powers. The Mississippian worldview, reconstructed from these images and from later accounts by their descendants, was one of balance between these three realms. The mounds themselves represented mountains, connections between the earthly realm and the sky realm. Leaders performed ceremonies on top of these mounds, positioning themselves as intermediaries between humans and the spirit world, between earth and sky, between chaos and order. In the Southwest, The ancestral Pueblo culture reached its peak at places like Chaco Canyon, a sophisticated urban center with massive great houses, precise astronomical alignments, and roads radiating outward to connect with distant communities. The mythology here was deeply tied to the sky. The Pueblo peoples developed detailed astronomical knowledge, tracking the sun's movement throughout the year, marking solstices and equinoxes with shadow markers and building alignments. This wasn't idle curiosity, it was sacred knowledge. The ceremonies that maintained the proper order of the world had to be performed at exactly the right times, determined by the sun's position. The sun was understood as a powerful being making its daily journey across the sky, and certain rituals helped ensure it would continue its journey, would return again each morning, would bring the proper seasons in their proper order. The Kachina tradition, still practiced today by Hopi and other Pueblo peoples, was highly developed during this period. Kachinas are spirit beings, hundreds of them, each associated with different aspects of nature, different times of year, different lessons to be taught. During ceremonies, dancers wearing elaborate masks and costumes not represent but actually become, these Kachinas, bringing the spirit world into physical manifestation. Children received carved Kachina dolls to learn to recognize and understand these different spirits. This mythology served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was a sophisticated ecological knowledge system, encoding information about weather patterns, plant cycles, animal behavior. It was a social control mechanism, teaching proper behavior and community values. It was entertainment and art, featuring stunning visual representations and elaborate performances. And it was, at its core, a genuine spiritual system through which people experienced the sacred. In the Pacific Northwest, this was the age of the great potlatches, ceremonial feasts where leaders demonstrated their status by giving away enormous quantities of goods, food, blankets, carved items, even slaves in some cases. These weren't just displays of wealth, they were mythologically mandated redistributions that maintained social balance. A leader who hoarded goods was violating the fundamental principle of reciprocity that the mythology emphasized. The creator beings, raven, wolf, bear, were all portrayed in stories as generous, sharing the gifts they possessed with others. The potlatch also served as a venue for the public performance of mythological heritage. When a family hosted a potlatch, they would perform dances and songs that told their clan's mythological history. They might wear masks representing ancestral spirits or transformation experiences. They would validate their claims to certain names, titles, and rights through the public recitation of their mythological lineage. The guests witnessing this served as validators. If no one objected or challenged the claims, they became socially recognized truth. The Eastern Woodlands peoples during this period had developed the Three Sisters agriculture system: corn, beans, and squash grown together in a mutually beneficial arrangement, and their mythology reflected this agricultural success. The Three Sisters were often personified as divine beings, or the daughters of the Earth Mother, who had given themselves to humanity as food. The green corn ceremony, practiced by many southeastern peoples, was a major annual event involving purification, feasting, renewal of sacred fires, and the forgiveness of debts and crimes, except murder. It marked the transition to the new year, both agricultural and spiritual. Among the Great Plains peoples, though agriculture was practiced in many areas, the buffalo remained central to both practical life and mythology. Buffalo weren't just food, they were sacred relatives, gifts from the Creator, beings who sacrificed themselves so humans could live. White Buffalo Calf Woman's gift of the sacred pipe was specifically about maintaining the proper relationship with the buffalo. The Sundance ceremony, practiced across the plains with regional variations, involved sacrifice and endurance as offerings to ensure the buffalo would return, the people would prosper, and balance would be maintained. What strikes me about this flourishing period is the integration. The mythology wasn't separate from daily life. It was the framework for understanding and organizing daily life. It explained why you planted corn when you did, why you conducted certain ceremonies at certain times, why you organized your household the way you did, why you treated elders with respect, why you shared resources with kin. The sacred and the practical were unified in a way that Western cultures, with their sharp division between religious and secular, sometimes struggle to comprehend. Let's pull back from the grand narratives for a moment and explore how these mythological systems actually functioned in everyday life. Because what made Native American mythology so powerful wasn't just the stories themselves, it was how thoroughly integrated they were into the practical mechanics of existence. Take hunting, for instance. Among the Cree peoples of the subarctic forests, hunting wasn't a purely technical activity. Before a hunt, prayers were offered. Not prayers asking for success exactly, but prayers acknowledging the relationship between hunter and hunted. The belief was that animals gave themselves to worthy hunters, those who showed respect, who used what they killed, who performed the proper rituals. If you were unsuccessful, it wasn't just bad luck. It might mean you had failed to show proper respect, had violated a taboo, had damaged your relationship with the animal spirits. After a kill, elaborate protocols governed how the animal was treated. Among many groups, you didn't boast about your success. That would be disrespectful to the animal's spirit. The bones were carefully disposed of in specific ways, often placed in trees or in water, returning them symbolically to the animal's spiritual home. Certain parts might be reserved for elders or for ceremonial purposes. The first kill of a young hunter required special ceremonies, marking his transition to adult status, while also establishing his relationship with the animal spirits. This wasn't superstition, it was sophisticated resource management wrapped in mythological language. These protocols ensured meat was shared, that hunters didn't kill more than needed, that successful hunters remained humble, that young hunters learned respect before they learned arrogance. The mythology provided the enforcement mechanism. If you violated these practices and then had a run of bad luck, everyone understood why. The animal spirits had withdrawn their favor. To restore it, you needed to make amends, conduct purification ceremonies, demonstrate you'd learned the lesson. Similarly, agricultural peoples had mythologically mandated practices that happened to align with good farming. The Haudenosaunee women, who controlled agriculture, knew that corn, beans, and squash grew well together, but they understood this through the story of the three sisters, who loved each other and thrived in each other's company. The corn provided a structure for the beans to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, nourishing the corn. The squash leaves shaded the ground, retaining moisture and preventing weeds. Modern agronomists recognize this as brilliant companion planting. The Haudenosaunee women understood it as honoring the relationship between three sister spirits. The timing of agricultural ceremonies corresponded to actual botanical necessities. The green corn ceremony happened when the corn reached a specific stage of ripeness. Springtime ceremonies for planting occurred when soil temperatures were right for seeds to germinate. The mythology provided the calendar and the motivation, ensuring that practical agricultural knowledge was transmitted and followed. Governance, too, operated through mythological frameworks. Among the Iroquois, the clan mothers who selected chiefs were acting on authority that came from the original instructions of the peacemaker and Hiawatha. Their role wasn't arbitrary, it was divinely mandated. This had practical effects. When a clan mother decided a chief was failing in his duties, she had the mythological authority to remove him, placing a ceremonial deer antler headdress on his successor. She didn't need to justify this to a court or win an election. The mythology granted her this power, and the community accepted it because they accepted the mythology. The consensus-based decision-making of many Native American societies was similarly rooted in mythological principles. The creator hadn't appointed a single supreme leader. The original instructions emphasized balance, multiple perspectives, distributed authority. So when the Haudenosaunee Confederacy met, representatives from all 6 nations needed to agree before major decisions were enacted. This wasn't inefficient democracy, it was following the original mythological template for how humans should organize themselves. Medicine and healing were perhaps where mythology and practice most obviously intertwined. A medicine person wasn't just someone who knew which plants treated which ailments, though they certainly possessed that knowledge, accumulated and tested over countless generations. They were individuals who had special relationships with the spirit world, often gained through vision quests, near-death experiences, or inheritance of sacred knowledge. When treating illness, a medicine person might use herbal remedies, and Native American pharmacology was genuinely sophisticated, with knowledge of hundreds of medicinal plants, many of which modern medicine has validated and incorporated. But they would also perform ceremonies, sing healing songs, work to identify and address spiritual causes of illness. Was the patient out of balance? Had they violated a taboo? Were they being influenced by malevolent spirits or suffering from witchcraft? This holistic approach, treating body, mind, and spirit together, wasn't primitive. In many ways, it was more sophisticated than the purely mechanical approach to medicine that dominated Western practice until quite recently. A patient healed through ritual and meaning, through restored social relationships and spiritual balance, might genuinely recover better than one who only received pharmaceutical intervention without context or explanation. Social relationships, too, were governed by mythologically established protocols: who you could marry, how you treated your in-laws, your obligations to your mother's family versus your father's family in matrilineal societies, what you owed to your clan or village or nation. All of this was explained and enforced through mythology. The stories told what happened to people who violated kinship obligations, who were selfish or cruel, who failed to share or show respect. These stories served as behavioral guides, the mythology enforcing social norms more effectively than any written law code. By the early 1500s, just before European contact fundamentally altered everything, Native American civilizations had reached a remarkable peak. Not a single peak, of course, hundreds of distinct peaks, each culture flourishing in its own way, each mythology adapted to its particular environment and social structure. In central Mexico, the Aztec Empire controlled a vast territory through a combination of military might, tributary relationships, and religious authority. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was one of the largest cities in the world, built on an island in Lake Texcoco, accessible by causeways, featuring pyramids, palaces, floating gardens called chinampas, and sophisticated aqueduct systems. The mythology of the fifth sun, the current age of the world, was at its most elaborate and integrated with imperial power. Every 52 years, the Aztecs held the new fire ceremony, a moment of cosmic anxiety when they weren't certain the sun would continue its cycle. All fires were extinguished. People fasted and prayed. On the night of the ceremony, priests watched for the Pleiades to reach their zenith, a specific astronomical moment. When it arrived, they lit a new fire on the chest of a sacrificial victim, and this sacred fire was carried throughout the empire, relighting all the hearths, symbolizing the continuation of the cosmos for another cycle. The entire society held its breath during this ceremony. The mythology wasn't just belief, it was living reality, anxiety-inducing and relief-providing. In the Andes, the Inca Empire had united dozens of previously independent peoples under a system that combined military conquest with religious integration. They didn't erase local mythologies, they incorporated them. Local deities became part of the Inca pantheon, but subordinate to Inti, the sun god, from whom the Inca emperor claimed descent. This created a mythological justification for political hierarchy. Just as Inti was supreme among the gods, so the Inca was supreme among humans. The Inca religion featured elaborate ceremonies, often involving pilgrimage to sacred huacas, places, objects or beings imbued with spiritual power. These could be springs, unusual rock formations, ancient battle sites, mummies of ancestors. The most important huacas received regular offerings. Some required the sacrifice of animals, corn beer, textiles. The most sacred, at the most critical moments, received human sacrifices, usually children selected for their perfection, who would walk or be carried high into the mountains to sacred sites where they would be ritually killed, becoming messengers to the gods. In North America, while no empires existed on the scale of the Aztec or Inca, the diversity and sophistication of mythological systems had reached impressive heights. The Pueblo people's ceremonial calendar was incredibly complex, with different Kiva societies responsible for different ceremonies throughout the year, each designed to maintain cosmic balance, ensure rain, promote crop growth, and strengthen community bonds. The Hopi alone recognized over 400 different Kachina spirits, each with specific characteristics, appearances, behaviors, and roles in the ceremonial cycle. Among the Pacific Northwest peoples, wealth and artistic expression had created what might be called a golden age of visual mythology. The totem poles reached their greatest artistic heights during this period, with master carvers creating pieces that were simultaneously artistic masterpieces and genealogical records encoded in mythological symbolism. Elaborate masks were carved for transformation dances, featuring mechanical elements that allowed dancers to open one mask to reveal another beneath, physically demonstrating the mythology of transformation and shape-shifting. The potlatch ceremonies reached their peak elaboration, sometimes lasting for days, involving the distribution of goods that represented years of accumulated wealth. These weren't just parties, they were the primary mechanism for redistributing resources, validating social claims, marking major life transitions, maintaining kinship obligations across vast distances, and publicly performing mythological heritage. The mythology that seemed like abstract stories in one context became embodied, performed, lived experience in these ceremonial spaces. On the Great Plains, the horse had recently been introduced and was transforming societies. Plains peoples quickly integrated horses into their mythologies. They weren't seen as imports, but as beings who had always existed in the spirit world and were now manifesting in physical form. The increased mobility horses provided intensified buffalo hunting, which in turn intensified the ceremonies and mythologies surrounding the buffalo. The sun dance became more elaborate, with participants from multiple bands gathering for ceremonies that reinforced shared identity and belief. What made this the pinnacle wasn't just material prosperity or social complexity, it was the sense of completeness, of wholeness, that these mythological systems provided. They answered every question that mattered. Where did we come from? The mythology explained. Why are we here? The mythology provided purpose. How should we live? The mythology gave detailed instructions. What happens when we die? The mythology described the journey of the soul. Why do bad things happen? The mythology explained through stories of balance, of sacred beings who sometimes tested humans, of the necessity of both light and shadow. For a person living within one of these mythological systems, the world made sense. It was enchanted, filled with meaning, interconnected. Every plant, every animal, every feature of the landscape had a story, a relationship to humans, a spiritual dimension. Daily activities, hunting, farming, cooking, building, were elevated to sacred significance through mythological context. Community rituals created shared experience that bound people together across generations as they performed the same ceremonies their ancestors had performed, would pass them on to descendants, participated in something eternal. This sense of completeness, of living in a world where mythology and reality were one, where the sacred permeated the ordinary, where community and cosmos were intimately connected. This was the true pinnacle, more significant than any material measure of complexity or sophistication. And none of them, standing at this peak, looking out at their world that had existed for thousands of years, could have imagined what was about to happen. None of them knew that ships were crossing the ocean, carrying people with entirely different mythologies, entirely different understandings of what land ownership meant, what religion was, what constituted civilization. None of them knew that within a few generations, everything would change. The arrival of Europeans wasn't a single event. It was a cascade of contacts, beginning in 1492 with Columbus in the Caribbean, spreading over decades and centuries as different European powers established footholds across the Americas. And at first, from the native perspective, these newcomers weren't necessarily catastrophic. They were strange, yes. They had unusual technologies. They didn't seem to understand basic principles of reciprocity. Their religious ideas were baffling. But they could be incorporated into existing worldviews, understood through mythological frameworks, dealt with through established diplomatic practices. The Taino people of the Caribbean initially believed Columbus and his men might be spirits or gods returning from the sea, not because they were naive, but because that's how they made sense of beings who arrived from beyond the known world in vessels unlike anything they'd seen. When these visitors demonstrated very ungodlike behavior, greed, violence, sexual assault, the Taino revised their understanding. But by then it was too late. The Spanish were establishing colonies, enslaving people, extracting gold, and inadvertently, at first, introducing diseases that would kill millions. The epidemiological catastrophe is hard to overstate. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, diseases to which Europeans had developed some immunity through centuries of exposure, tore through native populations that had no biological defenses. Estimates vary, but most scholars believe that within a century of sustained European contact, 90% or more of the native population of the Americas had died. 90%. Imagine what that does to a society, to a culture, to a mythological system. When massive numbers of people die, especially elders who carry knowledge, huge portions of oral tradition die with them. Ceremonies that required specific knowledge, performed by trained practitioners, could no longer be performed correctly, or at all. Sacred objects were lost or destroyed. Sites of pilgrimage became inaccessible as populations concentrated for survival. Languages, which carried mythological concepts that couldn't be perfectly translated, began to disappear as communities collapsed. The mythology itself was challenged by this catastrophe. If the world was supposed to be balanced, if humans and the sacred were in proper relationship, if performing ceremonies correctly ensured the proper order, then why were they dying in such numbers? Why couldn't the medicine people heal these diseases? Why didn't the ceremonies work? Some native peoples interpreted the epidemics through their existing mythological frameworks. Perhaps they had violated taboos, angered the spirits, lost the proper balance. But the scale of death was unprecedented, beyond anything the mythology had prepared them to understand. The Spanish, in their colonization of Mesoamerica and the Andes, didn't just extract resources and impose political control. They actively worked to destroy native mythologies, viewing them as paganism, devil worship, obstacles to conversion. Priests burned codices, the bark paper books that recorded Aztec and Mayan mythology in pictographic writing. Thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, cosmology, history, and science went up in flames because Catholic priests saw only heresy. Sacred sites were demolished, or, more insidiously, converted. The Spanish built churches on top of pyramids, literally suppressing native mythology beneath Christian structures. This wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. These sites were powerful in the native mythological geography. Places where the veil between physical and spirit world was thin, where ceremonies had been performed for centuries. By placing churches there, the Spanish attempted to transfer that sacred power to Christianity. In North America, the process was different, but no less devastating. English colonists in the Northeast encountered sophisticated agricultural societies with complex political organizations. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for instance, was at its peak, extending its influence through an elaborate system of alliances and trade relationships. But the colonists carried diseases, just as the Spanish had. They also brought different assumptions about land use and ownership that would prove incompatible with Native American worldviews. In Native American mythology, land wasn't something that could be owned. It was something you belonged to, had a relationship with, held in trust for future generations. The idea of selling land in the European sense, transferring permanent exclusive ownership, didn't exist. When native leaders sold land to colonists, they often thought they were granting permission to use the land, to share it, much as they might allow another native group hunting rights. The concept of excluding the original inhabitants, of transforming the land's entire purpose and ecology, was not what they understood themselves to be agreeing to. The Jamestown colony in Virginia, established in 1607, initially survived only because the Powhatan Confederacy provided food. This wasn't charity, it was the protocol of reciprocity embedded in their mythology. You help strangers, you share with those in need, you establish relationships through exchange. But the English didn't understand or honor reciprocity. They took without giving back proportionally. They demanded rather than asked. They violated every principle of balance that the Powhatan mythology emphasized. As conflicts arose, over land, resources, cultural misunderstandings, mythologies began to adapt. Prophet movements emerged among various native peoples, individuals who claimed to have received visions from the Creator or other sacred beings, offering explanations for what was happening and guidance for how to respond. Some of these prophets preached accommodation, learning from the newcomers, adopting useful technologies while maintaining core values. Others preached resistance, rejecting European ways, returning to traditional practices, uniting to drive out the invaders. The mythology was proving flexible, adaptive, trying to make sense of circumstances it had never needed to address before. But the fundamental problem remained. The scale and pace of change was overwhelming. Systems that had evolved over thousands of years to maintain balance were now encountering people whose entire worldview was predicated on transformation, on changing the natural world to suit human desires, on accumulation rather than circulation, on conversion rather than pluralism. And behind the immediate shocks, the diseases, the land conflicts, the violence, a deeper threat was emerging. The Europeans didn't just want native land and labour, they wanted native souls. The missionary project, whether Catholic or Protestant, aimed at nothing less than the complete replacement of native mythologies with Christianity. And this project would be backed not just by persuasion but by force, by law, by systematic efforts to separate children from families, to punish traditional practices, to make being native illegal. By the 1700s and teens, the assault on Native American mythologies had become systematic and deliberate. This wasn't just cultural change happening naturally through contact between peoples. This was policy, enforced through violence and law, designed specifically to destroy native identities and replace them with European Christian ones. The Spanish mission system in California, established beginning in 1769, illustrates the process. Native peoples were forcibly brought into missions, converted to Christianity, made to work in mission fields and workshops. Their traditional dress was replaced with European clothing. Their languages were forbidden. Children caught speaking their native languages were punished. Their ceremonies were banned as pagan practices. Their mythology was explicitly condemned as devil worship. When native peoples tried to maintain their traditions in secret, conducting ceremonies away from mission oversight, they were hunted down and punished. The mythology had to go underground, becoming hidden, whispered, performed in fragments when possible. Sacred objects were buried. Knowledge was passed on in secret, from elder to trusted young person, always with the risk of discovery and punishment. In the eastern United States, a different but equally destructive process was unfolding. As the new United States expanded westward, native peoples were forced from their lands through a combination of military defeat, fraudulent treaties, and explicit government policy. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the forced relocation of tens of thousands of native people from the southeast to Oklahoma, the Trail of Tears, which killed thousands during the journey itself. This removal severed the connection between people and their sacred landscapes. The Haudenosaunee had creation sites, places where Sky Woman landed, where the peacemaker performed his miracles. The Cherokee had sacred mountains, springs, caves where ceremonies had been performed for countless generations. Forced relocation meant these sites became inaccessible. Parts of the mythology that were tied to specific places, this is where the culture hero emerged. This spring was blessed by the ancestors. This rock contains powerful medicine, lost their physical anchor. On the Great Plains, the destruction of the buffalo herds represented an assault on mythology as much as on a food source. The buffalo wasn't just food, it was sacred relative, gift from the Creator, center of spiritual practice. Essent government deliberately pursued a policy of buffalo extermination in the 1870s and 1880s, killing millions of buffalo to starve plains peoples into submission and onto reservations. They were destroying the material foundation of the plains mythology. White Buffalo Calf Woman had brought the sacred pipe and promised the buffalo would always be there for the people if they maintained the proper relationship. Now the buffalo were gone. How to understand this? Was it punishment for failures? Was the mythology wrong? Or was it something the mythology had no framework to comprehend? A deliberate, industrial-scale destruction of a sacred being for explicitly political purposes. The reservation system itself was designed, at least in part, to make traditional native life impossible. Reservations were often on the poorest land, unable to support traditional subsistence patterns. Hunting grounds were outside reservation boundaries. Leaving to hunt was technically illegal. The seasonal migrations that many peoples had practiced, which were embedded in their ceremonial calendars, became impossible. The late 1800s brought a new level of cultural destruction, the boarding school system. Beginning in 1879, with the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, Native American children were forcibly removed from their families, sometimes taken at gunpoint, and sent to boarding schools, often far from home. At these schools, children were forbidden to speak their native languages. Their hair was cut, a violation in many cultures where hair had spiritual significance. They were given English names, Christian names, replacing the names that often had mythological significance or marked their place in kinship structures. They were forced to attend Christian services and punished for any practice of traditional spirituality. They were taught that their parents' ways were savage, ignorant, primitive, that everything about being native was shameful. Many children died in these schools from disease, malnutrition, or abuse. Those who survived often returned to their communities unable to speak their native language, cut off from the mythology and traditions, sometimes ashamed of their heritage. The intergenerational transmission of mythology, the natural process of elders teaching children through stories, ceremonies, example, was deliberately severed. The ghost dance movement of the late 1880s represents both the desperation of this period and the adaptability of native mythology. Wovoka, a Paiute prophet, had a vision during a solar eclipse. He saw the Creator, who told him that if native peoples performed a specific dance, wore special ghost shirts, and lived righteously, the dead would return, the buffalo would come back, and the white people would disappear. The old world would be restored. The ghost dance spread rapidly across the western reservations, incorporating elements from Christian millennialism but grounded in native mythological frameworks. Desperate peoples, facing cultural annihilation, found hope in this promised restoration. Government viewed the ghost dance as dangerous, a potential precursor to uprising. Army massacred them, at least 150 men, women, and children killed, their frozen bodies left in a mass grave. The ghost dance hadn't brought back the dead or restored the buffalo. Instead, it had brought more death, more trauma, more evidence that the old ways could not protect against the overwhelming force arrayed against them. Yet even in this darkest period, the mythology proved more resilient than the colonizers expected. It went underground, became hidden, adapted to survive. In the southwest, Pueblo peoples continued their ceremonies in secret, behind closed doors, maintaining the Kachina dances, the solstice observances, the agricultural rituals. When government agents or missionaries approached, the ceremonies stopped, resumed later. Knowledge was guarded more carefully, shared only with those who could be trusted absolutely. The Native American Church emerged during this period as a syncretic response, combining traditional spirituality with Christian elements centered on the ceremonial use of peyote, a sacred medicine that had been used for millennia in Mexico and was now spreading north. It wasn't a surrender to Christianity or an abandonment of native mythology. Among the Haudenosaunee, the Longhouse religion, formalized by the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake in the early 1800s, had provided a framework for cultural survival. Handsome Lake had experienced visions in which he traveled to the spirit world and received instructions from the Creator. His teachings, called the Code of Handsome Lake, combined traditional Haudenosaunee values with adaptations to the new reality. It acknowledged the presence of Europeans but maintained Haudenosaunee identity, ceremonies, and core mythology. It provided a middle way between complete assimilation and impossible resistance. Different peoples, different regions found different strategies for survival. Some adopted Christianity but maintained native identity and certain traditional practices. Others outwardly conformed while secretly preserving ceremonies and knowledge. Still others found ways to encode mythology in art, beadwork, basket designs, pottery, visual languages that could preserve stories even when oral transmission was suppressed. The unraveling wasn't complete, wasn't total, but the damage was profound. Languages that carried untranslatable mythological concepts were dying. Ceremonies that required specific knowledge, specific objects, specific conditions could no longer be performed. Sacred sites were desecrated, built over, declared off-limits. The intergenerational chain of transmission had been broken in countless places. Elders died without being able to pass on their knowledge. Children grew up without learning the stories, without experiencing the ceremonies, without speaking the language that carried their people's understanding of the cosmos. The early 20th century represented perhaps the nadir, the lowest point, for Native American mythologies. The combined effects of disease, forced relocation, land loss, boarding schools, and legal suppression of traditional practices had brought many native cultures to the brink of extinction. Government policy was explicitly assimilationist. The goal wasn't just to control native peoples, but to make them disappear as distinct cultures. The Dawes Act of 1887 had divided communal reservation lands into individual allotments, a policy designed to destroy collective land ownership and impose European concepts of private property. Surplus land, which is to say most of the land, was open to white settlement. This further eroded the land base while also attacking the communal values embedded in native mythologies, which almost universally emphasize sharing, reciprocity, and collective responsibility over individual accumulation. By the 1920s, native population in the United States had reached its lowest point, perhaps 250,000 people, down from millions before contact. Many languages had no fluent speakers left. Entire peoples had been absorbed into other groups, their distinct mythologies lost. The boarding school system was at its peak, with tens of thousands of native children forcibly separated from their families. On many reservations, traditional ceremonies were still illegal, punishable by imprisonment. The mythology, for many peoples, existed only in fragments. An elder might remember parts of a creation story, but not the whole thing. A few people might know one ceremony, but not have the sacred objects needed to perform it properly. Sacred bundles that contained powerful items, pipes, masks, medicine objects, had been confiscated by government agents, sold to collectors, or hidden away so carefully they'd been lost. The complete integrated mythological systems that had guided life for thousands of years had been shattered into pieces. For the Yahi people of California, this period brought actual extinction. Ishi, the last Yahi, walked out of the wilderness in 1911, the sole survivor of his people, carrying with him a complete mythology, a whole way of understanding the world that would die with him. Anthropologists recorded what they could, but Ishi couldn't share everything. Much of his knowledge was sacred, not meant for outsiders, and he died in 1916, knowing his people's complete mythology would die with him. This was happening in less dramatic ways across the continent. The last speaker of a language would die. The last person who knew how to perform a specific ceremony would pass away without an apprentice. The last elder who remembered the full version of a sacred story would be gone. Each death was an irreplaceable loss, a part of humanity's mythological heritage disappearing forever. The breaking point wasn't a single moment, but rather a decades-long period when it genuinely seemed that Native American cultures and their mythologies might not survive at all. Federal policy assumed they wouldn't, that native peoples would eventually assimilate completely into mainstream American society, becoming indistinguishable except perhaps for some physical features. The museums filling with native artifacts weren't seen as stealing from living cultures, but as preserving relics of vanishing ones, collecting the remains of peoples who were expected to disappear. And yet, in this darkest period, resistance continued. Sometimes it was dramatic. Armed confrontations, legal battles, political organizing. More often it was quiet, personal, stubborn. A grandmother teaching her grandchildren the language in secret. A family maintaining a ceremony in their home, away from official view. A community hiding sacred objects and bringing them out only when absolutely safe. A prophet receiving a vision and sharing it with trusted people. An artist encoding traditional stories in beadwork that looked merely decorative to outsiders, but carried deep meaning for those who could read it. The 1930s brought a shift in federal policy with the Indian Reorganization Act, which ended the allotment system and recognized tribal sovereignty to a limited degree. This wasn't a complete reversal. Boarding schools continued and many assimilationist policies remained, but it represented a recognition that native peoples weren't disappearing and perhaps shouldn't be forced to. Some traditional practices became legal again, though many remained suppressed. World War II created an unexpected opening. Native Americans served in the military in high numbers, including the famous Navajo code talkers, who used their language, the same language that boarding schools had tried to erase, to create an unbreakable code. This challenged some stereotypes, gave Native veterans a platform to demand better treatment, and demonstrated that Native identity could coexist with American citizenship. After the war, Native activism began to grow. Veterans who had fought for American freedom overseas were less willing to accept discrimination at home. Young Native people, educated in boarding schools and universities, began organizing, combining traditional values with modern political strategies. They hadn't forgotten the mythology. Many had been raised with fragments of it, had heard stories from grandparents, had experienced ceremonies performed in secret, and now they began to reclaim it more openly. The breaking point, it turned out, wasn't the end. It was a transition, a passage through the darkest moment towards something new. The mythology had been broken, yes, but not destroyed. It had been suppressed, but not eliminated. It had been fragmented, but the pieces remained, waiting to be gathered up, to be studied, to be restored where possible, to be adapted where necessary. By mid-century, a picture was emerging of what had survived. The mythology hadn't been preserved intact. How could it be after centuries of systematic destruction? But neither had it been completely erased. What remained was uneven, scattered, in different states of preservation depending on geography, the intensity of colonization, the strategies of resistance employed, and sometimes just luck. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest had perhaps the most complete continuity, partly because Spanish colonization, while brutal, had left more room for cultural survival than later Anglo-American policies. Partly because Pueblo peoples had refined the art of appearing to accept Christianity while maintaining traditional practices, and partly because their ceremonial calendar was so deeply embedded in daily life, in agricultural cycles, in village organization, in the physical structure of kivas and plazas, that it proved almost impossible to completely suppress. When anthropologists came to study Pueblo cultures in the early 20th century, they found ceremonies still being performed that had clear connections to pre-contact practices. The Kachina dances continued. The ceremonial calendar still governed much of village life. The creation stories were still told, though now more carefully guarded, less freely shared with outsiders. Pueblo peoples had learned to protect their mythology by controlling access to it, determining what could be shared and what must remain secret. The Navajo too had maintained substantial continuity, particularly in their healing ceremonies. The elaborate sand paintings, created during healing rituals and destroyed afterwards, preserved mythological knowledge in a form that couldn't be permanently stolen. You could photograph a sand painting, but you couldn't capture the songs, the prayers, the ritual knowledge of how and when to create it, what each symbol meant, how it connected to the larger mythological framework. This knowledge remained with trained practitioners, passed down through apprenticeship, protected by the very complexity that made it powerful. Among the Haudenosaunee, the Longhouse religion had preserved core elements of traditional mythology while adapting to new circumstances. The creation story of Sky Woman remained central. The great law of peace continued to be recited at gatherings. The ceremonies marking different seasons, midwinter, maple, planting, strawberry, green corn, harvest, continued to be performed in longhouses on the reservations. The language, while endangered, still had speakers. The clan system remained important in social organization. In the Pacific Northwest, despite aggressive attempts to ban potlatches, which were officially illegal in Canada from 1885 to 1951, the ceremonies had continued in modified forms or in secret. The totem pole carving tradition, while interrupted, hadn't been completely lost. Families still knew their mythological histories, their clan associations. The transformation masks, dance regalia, and ceremonial objects that hadn't been confiscated or sold to museums were carefully preserved, hidden away, waiting for a time when they could safely be brought out again. But what remained was often fragmentary. An elder might know that their people had performed a specific ceremony, but not remember exactly how it was done. Stories might be remembered in outline, but without the details, the poetry, the precise language that had made them powerful. Sacred songs might be recalled partially, missing verses, with words whose meanings had been forgotten. The integrated, complete mythological systems had been broken into pieces. Some of those pieces existed in unexpected places. Museums and universities held collections of sacred objects, recorded stories, documentation of ceremonies. Some of this material had been collected by anthropologists who, despite their paternalistic attitudes and problematic methods, at least documented what they observed. Franz Boas, working with Northwest Coast peoples in the late 1800s and early 1900s, recorded stories, ceremonies, and languages in remarkable detail. While his work has been criticized for various reasons, it preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been completely lost. Some boarding school students, despite the traumatic experience, had written down stories they remembered from childhood, preserving them in school assignments or private journals. Some native people who had converted to Christianity had incorporated mythological elements into their new religious framework, creating syncretic forms that preserved pieces of the old knowledge. Some families had maintained private ceremonies, never letting them become public, passing knowledge down within trusted kinship networks. The challenge for mid-20th century native peoples was figuring out what to do with these fragments. Some elders felt that partial knowledge was dangerous, that performing ceremonies incorrectly, telling stories without proper context, using sacred objects inappropriately, could cause harm. Better to let things remain hidden than to do them wrong. Others felt that partial knowledge was better than no knowledge, that even fragments were worth preserving, worth building on, worth adapting to new circumstances. There were also questions about language. Many mythological concepts didn't translate well into English. The stories, when told in English, lost layers of meaning, lost the poetry and rhythm that made them powerful, lost connections to the landscape that were embedded in place, names and linguistic structures. But many young native people no longer spoke their ancestral languages fluently. Should the mythology be shared in English so it could reach them, even if something essential was lost? Or should teaching focus first on language restoration, accepting that fewer people would access the mythology in the short term? Different communities made different choices. Some focused on language revitalization, understanding that without the language, the mythology couldn't be fully transmitted. Others prioritized getting young people involved in ceremonies, even if those ceremonies had been modified or simplified. Still others worked to repatriate sacred objects from museums, believing that having the physical items back would help restore associated knowledge and practices. What had definitely survived across almost all native peoples was a sense of distinctness, of identity rooted in something older and deeper than the colonial experience. Even native people who had been thoroughly assimilated, who spoke only English, who practiced Christianity, who had never heard the traditional stories. Many still knew they were native, still felt connected to that identity, still sensed that their people had a different origin, a different relationship to this land than the colonizers. This identity, this sense of being native, was itself mythologically rooted, even when the specific mythology had been forgotten. It was the residue of thousands of years of distinct cultural development, of different ways of understanding humanity's place in the cosmos. It was what had survived when almost everything else had been taken away. And it would prove to be the seed from which cultural renewal would grow. As native peoples began to assert themselves more forcefully in the 1960s and 70s, part of that assertion involved reclaiming their mythologies, studying them, revitalizing them, demanding respect for them. The American Indian movement, founded in 1968, fought for sovereignty, land rights, and treaty obligations, but also for cultural respect and preservation. The occupation of Alcatraz Island in 1969, the Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972, the standoff at Wounded Knee in 1973. These protests had political aims, but they also represented a cultural awakening, a refusal to let native identities disappear. This period saw increased native control over how their mythologies were studied, taught, and shared. For decades, non-native anthropologists had come into native communities, collected stories and objects, and published or displayed them without community permission or input. Now, native scholars and community leaders began demanding consultation, control over sacred knowledge, and repatriation of cultural items. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, passed in 1990, required museums and universities to return sacred objects and human remains to tribes. This wasn't just about physical items, it was about restoring connections to ancestors, to ceremonial traditions, to mythological knowledge that had been locked away in storage rooms. When a sacred pipe bundle was returned, it brought with it the possibility of restoring ceremonies, of reconnecting with the mythology that surrounded that object. Language revitalization efforts accelerated. Communities that had only a handful of elderly fluent speakers began intensive documentation projects, creating dictionaries, teaching materials, immersion programs. The understanding had grown that language wasn't just a communication tool, it was the carrier of worldview, of mythology, of ways of thinking that couldn't be fully expressed in English. If the language died, something essential about the mythology died with it. But revival wasn't simple restoration. It couldn't be. Too much had been lost, and the world had changed too much. Native peoples in the late 20th century lived in a fundamentally different context than their ancestors had. Most lived in houses, not traditional dwellings. Many worked wage jobs, attended universities, lived in cities. They existed in a modern technological world with television, cars, computers, and later the internet. The mythology couldn't simply be restored to its pre-contact form. It had to be adapted to contemporary life. This created tensions. Some traditional elders felt that modified or adapted ceremonies weren't valid, that mixing traditional practices with modern life diluted their power. Others argued that mythology had always adapted, had always evolved, and that adaptation was necessary for survival. Some objected to native mythology being taught in universities, published in books, shared in public forums. Sacred knowledge should remain sacred, controlled, protected. Others felt that sharing was necessary for survival, that the old model of secrecy was what had led to so much knowledge being lost. The mythology also began to influence non-native people in new ways. The environmental movement of the 1970s drew inspiration from Native American concepts of living in harmony with nature, of recognizing humanity's interconnection with all life. This often involved romanticization and appropriation, the noble savage stereotype, New Age practitioners adopting native ceremonies without understanding or permission, non-native people claiming native heritage they didn't have. But it also represented a genuine recognition that Native American mythologies contained wisdom that Western culture needed. The idea that land is sacred, not just a resource to exploit. The concept of making decisions based on their impact 7 generations in the future. The understanding that humans are part of nature's web, not separate from or above it. These mythologically rooted values began to influence environmental ethics, sustainability movements, and ecological thinking. Native artists began incorporating traditional mythological themes into contemporary art forms. See, Canon created works that combine traditional imagery with modern artistic techniques and sometimes subversive commentary on native stereotypes. Sculptors like Alan Hauser drew on traditional stories while working in contemporary styles. Writers like N. Scott Momaday, Leslie Marmon Silko, and Louise Erdrich wove traditional mythology into novels and poetry, making these stories accessible to new generations and broader audiences. Film and television provided new mediums for mythological storytelling. Smoke Signals, 1998, based on Sherman Alexie's work, brought contemporary native life and perspective to mainstream audiences. Documentaries began telling native history from native perspectives, incorporating traditional stories and perspectives rather than just the colonial narrative. More recently, shows like Reservation Dogs have featured traditional stories and ceremonies as natural parts of contemporary native life. The mythology's legacy also appears in place names across the Americas, though often in corrupted or anglicized forms. Rivers, mountains, states, cities carry names derived from indigenous languages, usually referring to mythologically significant features or events. These names are traces, reminders that this land had meaning, had stories, long before Europeans arrived. Contemporary native peoples have found ways to maintain connection to their mythologies while living modern lives. Traditional ceremonies are performed on weekends. Creation stories are shared at family gatherings. Elders visit schools to teach language and culture. Powwows bring together people from different nations, creating intertribal spaces where distinct mythologies are respected while shared native identity is celebrated. Online platforms and social media enable native people to connect across distances, share knowledge, discuss how to balance tradition with contemporary life. The mythology is neither dead nor unchanged. It's living, evolving, adapted but recognizable, fragmented but powerful. It shapes how many native people understand their identity, their obligations, their relationship to land and to community. It provides alternative frameworks for understanding existence, for organizing society, for relating to the non-human world. Frameworks that increasingly seem relevant not just to native peoples, but to anyone struggling with the social and ecological crises of our time. But this rediscovery has been complicated, sometimes revealing as much about the archaeologists and their assumptions as about the cultures they studied. The mound builder sites of the eastern United States puzzled early archaeologists so much that many initially refused to believe Native Americans had built them. Surely such impressive earthworks, Cahokia's Monk's Mound covers 14 acres at its base and rises 100 feet high, must have been created by some lost race, perhaps descendants of the lost tribes of Israel or refugees from Atlantis. This racist logic couldn't accept that indigenous peoples were capable of such sophisticated engineering and social organization. It took decades of archaeological work to firmly establish that, yes, the ancestors of modern Native Americans had built these sites, had created urban centers that rivaled medieval European cities in size and complexity, had developed sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. The mythology encoded in the mound structures, the effigy mounds shaped like animals, the astronomical alignments, the symbolic placement of different mound types, became clear only as archaeologists learned to take Native American oral traditions seriously. The cliff dwellings of the Southwest similarly challenged assumptions. Early explorers found these elaborate multi-story structures built into cliff faces and wondered who could have created them, initially refusing to credit the Pueblo peoples whose ancestors had actually built them. Archaeological work revealed sophisticated understanding of solar heating, south-facing exposures in winter, natural cooling, shade in summer, water management, and defensive positioning. The kivas built into these sites connected physical structures to mythological understanding, the underground ceremonial spaces echoing the sipapu through which humans emerged. In Mesoamerica, the decipherment of Maya glyphs beginning in the 1960s revolutionized understanding of Maya civilization. Early scholars had assumed the glyphs were purely calendrical or astronomical. As the writing system was decoded, it revealed detailed historical records, mythological texts, royal genealogies, and conquest narratives. The Popol Vuh, a Quiche Maya creation story that had survived in written form from the colonial period, could suddenly be connected to much older carved texts, revealing continuity of mythological tradition stretching back more than 1,000 years. The mythology literally carved in stone or painted on pottery, woven into textiles, preserved in codices that survived the Spanish burning, revealed sophisticated cosmologies. The Maya concept of multiple creations and destructions, with humanity being created and recreated until the gods finally got it right using corn, parallels other Native American creation myths while having its own distinct character. The elaborate calendar systems, which tracked multiple simultaneous cycles with mathematical precision, weren't just timekeeping, they were mythological, connecting earthly events to cosmic cycles, human time to divine time. Archaeological evidence has also confirmed what oral traditions had maintained, that Native American civilizations had been far more interconnected than previously assumed. The Chaco Canyon road system, visible from aerial photography, linked distant communities in a network that clearly served ceremonial and mythological purposes, not just trade. Seashells from the Gulf of Mexico found in Great Lakes burial sites, copper from Lake Superior found in the southwest, obsidian from Yellowstone found across the plains, all evidence of extensive trade networks that also transmitted mythological ideas. The study of archaeoastronomy has revealed how thoroughly mythology was embedded in the built environment. Serpent Mound in Ohio aligns with the summer solstice sunset. Numerous structures across the Americas mark equinoxes, solstices, or significant rising and setting points of stars and planets. These weren't just interesting observations, they were mythologically significant moments when the boundary between physical and spiritual worlds was thinnest, when ceremonies had maximum power, when the cosmic order was reaffirmed. Modern scientific techniques have provided unexpected insights. Analysis of ancient DNA has confirmed what native oral traditions maintained, that their ancestors had lived on this continent for thousands of years, not centuries. Paleobotany has revealed the sophisticated plant breeding that developed corn from teosinte, a process so remarkable that some mythologies weren't exaggerating when they attributed it to divine intervention. The transformation of a nearly inedible grass into one of the world's most important crops over thousands of years of careful selection was genuinely miraculous, whether understood mythologically or scientifically. Climate science has helped explain some mythological elements. Stories of great floods are found in many Native American traditions, and we now know there were massive floods at the end of the Ice Age as glaciers melted. The collapse of major civilizations like the classic Maya has been connected to severe droughts. What seemed like purely mythological explanations for catastrophes often contained historical memory of actual events, transmitted through generations, eventually taking mythological form. But perhaps most importantly, contemporary scholars, particularly native scholars, have challenged the entire framework of archaeological interpretation. They've pointed out that treating Native American cultures as dead civilizations to be discovered and interpreted by outsiders is itself a colonial act. The communities whose ancestors created these sites still exist, still have oral traditions about them, still consider them sacred. The mythology isn't a puzzle to be solved by outsiders, it's living tradition that belongs to the communities that have preserved it. This has led to more collaborative archaeology, where native communities are consulted, where traditional knowledge is respected alongside scientific evidence, where the descendant communities have say in how sites are excavated, interpreted, and presented. Some sacred sites are being closed to archaeological investigation at tribal request. The desire to study and know must be balanced against the right of communities to keep certain things sacred and protected. The rediscovery, then, is ongoing and incomplete. We know far more about Native American mythologies than we did 50 or 100 years ago. But we also know how much has been irretrievably lost, and we're learning to respect that some knowledge isn't meant to be universally accessible. The mythology isn't a relic to be excavated and displayed. It's a living tradition whose full depth and meaning remain, appropriately, in the hands of the peoples who have preserved it. When we step back from the specific stories, the particular ceremonies, the distinct beliefs of hundreds of different peoples, patterns emerge. Themes that appear again and again across Native American mythologies, suggesting something profound about human meaning-making and about these lands that shaped it. The first pattern is relationality. In almost every Native American mythological system, humans exist in a web of relationships with other beings, animals, plants, landforms, spirit entities, ancestors, descendants yet unborn. You aren't an isolated individual making your way through an inert material world. You're kin to the deer, related to the corn, obligated to the river, answerable to your grandmother's grandmother, and to your great-great-grandchildren. Every action ripples through this web of relationships. Compare this to the Western philosophical tradition, which spent centuries defining the human as fundamentally separate from nature, which drew sharp lines between rational humans and instinct-driven animals, between the spiritual soul and the material body, between the exceptional individual and the collective mass. Native American mythologies generally don't make these separations. The boundaries are permeable. Humans can become animals. Animals can become human. The physical and spiritual are intertwined, not divided. The individual matters, but always in relation to the collective. This mythological understanding of relationality has practical implications. If the salmon are your relatives who sacrifice themselves to feed you, you develop elaborate ceremonies honoring that sacrifice, rules ensuring you don't take more than you need, gratitude as a daily practice. If the forest is a community of beings you're related to, not a resource to exploit, you approach it differently. If your actions affect 7 generations, you make different decisions than if you're only concerned with quarterly profit reports. The second pattern is balance. Almost every creation story, every trickster tale, every ceremony description emphasizes the need for balance between opposing forces. Light and dark, summer and winter, giving and taking, individual and community, stability and change. The goal isn't to eliminate one side in favor of the other, it's to maintain dynamic equilibrium between them. The Iroquois twins, one creating useful things and one creating difficulties, don't destroy each other. They both continue to exist, both shaping the world. The Navajo concept of hodsho translates as beauty or harmony, but it more deeply means balance, the proper order of things, everything in its right relationship. When things go wrong, illness, conflict, drought, misfortune, It's often understood as imbalance, and the ceremonial response is aimed at restoration of balance, not punishment of evil. This is fundamentally different from the dualistic mythologies that divide the cosmos into good and evil, God and Satan, light and darkness, with the goal being the ultimate victory of good over evil. Native American mythologies generally don't work that way. Evil, as an absolute category, often doesn't exist in the same form. There are dangerous beings, malevolent spirits, destructive forces, but they're part of the cosmic order, necessary for balance. The goal is to maintain right relationship with them, to keep them in their proper place, not to eliminate them entirely. The third pattern is reciprocity. The mythology emphasizes that everything operates on gift exchange. The animals give themselves as food, and humans must give thanks, must use everything, must perform ceremonies honoring the gift. The plants provide medicine, and humans must make offerings, must harvest properly, must not take greedily. The spirits provide visions and power, and humans must conduct appropriate ceremonies, must fulfill obligations, must share wisdom received. This isn't transactional in a commercial sense. You don't pay the deer for its meat. It's relational reciprocity, the kind of mutual obligation that exists in healthy kinship systems. You help your relatives not because you expect immediate payback, but because that's how relationships work, how communities function, how balance is maintained. And you trust that when you need help, it will be there, because everyone is embedded in this same web of reciprocal obligation. The violation of reciprocity appears repeatedly in mythology as the cause of problems. The hunter who kills wastefully finds that animals won't give themselves to him. The gatherer who takes all the plants without leaving seed for regrowth causes scarcity. The person who receives a vision but doesn't fulfill its obligations suffers consequences. The chief who hoards resources rather than sharing them loses legitimacy. The mythology teaches that taking without giving back breaks the fundamental order of existence. The fourth pattern is place. Unlike the universalizing mythologies of Christianity, Islam, or Buddhism, which claim applicability everywhere, Native American mythologies are profoundly rooted in specific places. This mountain is where Sky Woman landed. This spring is where the first man emerged. This valley is where Coyote released the salmon. This grove is where the ancestors are buried. The mythology can't be separated from geography without losing essential meaning. This creates a different relationship to land than the Western concept of property or territory. This isn't just land your people happen to live on, it's the land that shaped your people, that your mythology emerged from, that your identity is inseparable from. The forced relocations weren't just about losing territory, they were about being torn from the mythologically significant landscape, being separated from the places where your people's story happened, where your ceremonies were meant to be performed. The environmental crisis of our time makes this mythologically rooted relationship to place increasingly relevant. When land is sacred, not just valuable, you don't strip mine it. When a mountain is your ancestor, not a resource, you don't remove its top for coal. When the river is a being with rights and agency, not just water flowing past, you don't treat it as a sewer. Native American mythologies, in their insistence that specific places are sacred, that humans are part of, not separate from the natural world, offer alternatives to the exploitative relationship to land that has characterized much of industrial civilization. The fifth pattern is transformation. Shapeshifting appears constantly, humans becoming animals, animals becoming human, one thing transforming into another. This isn't just magical fantasy, it's a mythological expression of the fundamental interconnectedness of all beings, the permeability of boundaries, the possibility of change and adaptation. The trickster figures embody this: Coyote, Raven, Iktomi, constantly transforming, adapting, trying new things, sometimes succeeding, but often failing spectacularly. They're models not just of what to avoid, but of adaptability itself, of the creative force that tries new approaches, breaks rules, recombines elements in unexpected ways. They're essential to creation and ongoing existence precisely because they're unpredictable, because they disrupt stasis, because they embody change. This mythological embrace of transformation has enabled the remarkable cultural survival of native peoples. When confronted with catastrophic change, the mythology provided frameworks for adaptation without total loss of identity. It's not that everything must remain frozen in traditional form. The mythology itself, with its emphasis on transformation, its trickster heroes, its stories of adaptation, provided permission and models for changing while remaining native. These patterns, relationality, balance, reciprocity, place, transformation, aren't unique to Native American mythologies. Elements appear in other indigenous traditions worldwide, in ancient mythologies of many peoples, even in philosophical and religious traditions that developed independently. Perhaps they're universal human insights, discovered and expressed differently by different peoples. Or perhaps they're particularly clear in mythologies that developed in close connection to the natural world over thousands of years, uninterrupted by the agricultural and industrial revolutions that reshaped so much human consciousness. What makes Native American mythologies particularly important now, in this moment of ecological crisis, social fragmentation, and search for meaning beyond materialism, is that they've survived. They offer not ancient museum pieces, but living alternatives, frameworks that evolved for a very long time, that were tested against reality across countless generations, that proved adaptive enough to survive deliberate attempts at destruction, that remain meaningful to their bearers today. So here we are, at the end of this long journey through time, through space, through hundreds of distinct peoples and their ways of understanding existence. We began before there was earth or sky, with Sky Woman falling through a hole in the clouds, with beings emerging from lower worlds into this one, with the rock squeezing blood from its veins to create companions. We've witnessed the age of transformation, when the rules of reality were still being written. We've seen the culture heroes bringing gifts of fire, corn, the sacred pipe, the laws of peace. We've watched societies flourish, building cities, developing sophisticated agricultural systems, creating vast trading networks, producing art of stunning beauty and complexity. We've seen mythology integrated into every aspect of life, providing meaning, order, identity, connection to land and to each other and to the sacred. And we've witnessed the catastrophe, disease killing millions, forced relocations tearing people from sacred landscapes, boarding schools stealing children, systematic attempts to destroy every trace of native identity and culture. We've seen the mythology suppressed, fragmented, forced underground. We've witnessed what looked like the end, when it seemed these rich traditions might disappear entirely, becoming nothing but museum exhibits and scholarly footnotes. But we've also seen survival, the hidden ceremonies, the protected knowledge, the stubborn maintenance of identity even when almost everything else was taken. We've watched the renewal, the revitalization, the reclaiming of language and ceremony and mythology. We've witnessed adaptation, the ways native peoples have found to remain native while living in the modern world, to maintain traditions while adapting to new circumstances. The mythology we've explored tonight isn't a single unified system. It never was. It's hundreds of distinct traditions, each with its own creation stories, its own pantheon of spirits and heroes, its own ceremonies and protocols. What unifies them isn't uniformity, but shared patterns, the emphasis on relationship, balance, reciprocity, connection to place, embrace of transformation. These mythologies matter. They matter first and foremost to native peoples themselves, as frameworks for identity, as connections to ancestors, as guides for living, as sacred heritage maintained across centuries of oppression. But they also matter to all of us, as humanity confronts ecological collapse, social fragmentation, the emptiness of purely materialistic worldviews. The Native American understanding that land is sacred, that all beings are relatives, that humans are part of, not masters of, the natural world, that actions should be considered in terms of their impact 7 generations forward. That community is more important than individual accumulation, that reciprocity rather than extraction should govern our relationships. These aren't just poetic notions. They're practical wisdom, tested across millennia, urgently relevant to contemporary crises. The mythology also teaches us about resilience. These traditions survived deliberate, systematic attempts at genocide, both physical and cultural. They survived because people risked everything to maintain them. Grandmothers teaching languages in secret, families performing ceremonies behind closed doors, elders protecting sacred knowledge, artists encoding traditions in forms colonizers couldn't recognize, communities adapting without surrendering essential identity. If you're listening tonight from one of the many places across the Americas where native people still live, still maintain their traditions, you're on land that has stories stretching back thousands of years, stories that predate nations and borders, stories that are still being told, still being lived. Those stories are part of what makes this place particular, distinct, sacred, not in some abstract sense, but concretely, in the memories and meanings that have accumulated here. And if you're listening from elsewhere, curious about these mythologies that emerged from lands you've never visited, I hope you've gained not just knowledge but respect for the sophistication of these traditions, for the peoples who created and maintained them, for the wisdom they contain, for the incredible fact of their survival. The story of Native American mythology isn't finished. It's not a tale of the past, but an ongoing narrative. Languages are being revitalized. Ceremonies are being restored or adapted. Young Native people are learning traditions from elders, finding ways to be native in the 21st century, writing new chapters in these ancient stories. The mythology lives on, changed but recognizable, challenged but resilient, particular to specific peoples, but offering universal insights. These endings don't resolve everything tidily. They acknowledge that the story continues beyond the telling, that listeners will make their own meanings, that the telling itself is an act of keeping the story alive for another generation. So, this is what happened, as it was told to me through research and study, imperfectly conveyed in a language that can't fully capture concepts that were meant to be expressed in hundreds of other languages, in specific places, embedded in ceremonies and daily life. The full story is beyond any one telling, beyond any single perspective, too vast and various to ever be completely captured. But the fragments we've explored tonight, the pieces that survived, that were recorded, that can be respectfully shared, they offer glimpses into ways of understanding existence that are both ancient and urgently contemporary. They remind us that there are other ways to organize societies, other ways to relate to the land, other frameworks for meaning than the ones that currently dominate. The Native American mythologies say, you are related to everything. You are part of something larger than yourself. Your actions ripple through webs of connection. Balance must be maintained. Reciprocity is essential. Place matters. Transformation is constant. And the sacred isn't separate from the ordinary, but woven through every moment. These are not primitive beliefs that we've outgrown. They're sophisticated wisdom that we desperately need. Thank you for listening tonight, for joining me on this journey through time and story. I hope it stirred your curiosity, deepened your respect, maybe changed how you think about the land you live on, the stories that shape you, your place in the web of existence. Where will you go from here? Perhaps to learn more about the specific native peoples whose traditional territories you live on. Perhaps to explore the writers, artists, and scholars, particularly native ones, who are keeping these traditions alive and sharing them with new generations. Perhaps simply to walk outside with fresh awareness of the stories that might have been told about the place you're standing. The relationships that might have been recognized. The sacred significance that predates whatever use the land has now. The story continues. And in listening tonight, you've become part of it. Another person learning these stories, thinking about them, being influenced by them. That's how oral traditions work. They live not in books or museums, but in the minds of people who hear them, think about them, pass them on. And so it is. And so it continues. And so the stories remain alive, waiting to be heard again, to shape new listeners, to offer their ancient wisdom to our contemporary moment. The mythology isn't finished. It's still being created, still being lived, still inviting us into a different understanding of what it means to be human in a more than human world. Until next time, friend, may you walk in balance,